Ladies and gentlemen, may I first say what a pleasure and a privilege it is to be back in Northam after all these years. I used to be an ag journo roaming through the Wheatbelt at will back in the 1970s, so it's really nice to be back and see the town of Northam thriving and the landscape looking, you know, better than I remember it actually, so well done. I'm going to give you the big picture, the global picture, not what's happening around here, but what's happening worldwide. And some of that's pretty grim. I ask your patience because I'm going to come to some things that are pretty positive and optimistic as well. We are facing the greatest challenge in human history. How we are going to feed 10 billion people sustainably for more than half a century. Tonight there's going to be 216,000 more people to dinner than there were last night. And while its growth rate is slowing, the human population continues to expand. And it's likely to get to 10 billion by the 2060s, not just because of more babies being born, but also because of old people living longer. Consumers in China, India, Brazil and the other newly advancing countries are demanding far more meat and high protein in their diets. And together these two factors are going to double global demand for food within 50 years. By the 2060s, what this means is we're going to have to find something like 600 quadrillion calories of food every single day to feed that human population. So my first point is that whatever they say in the press, the central issue in the human destiny in the 21st century is whether we can achieve and sustain such a mighty harvest. What has changed since the Green Revolution is that our food systems are now facing critical limitations, right? We could just perhaps throw science at this problem, but there are emerging scarcities in almost everything you need to produce good food. Scarcities of water, land, nutrients, oil, technology, skills, fish, finance, stable climates. And each of these scarcities affects all the others. So this is just not a simple problem that you can easily solve with a techno fix or a national policy change. It is what's known as a wicked problem. Let's start with water. The world is becoming acutely scarce of clean, fresh water. In China, India and the US, groundwater is seriously depleted. Climate change is robbing rainfall over the Great Grain Bowls. Snowpack on the high mountains, lakes, rivers and aquifers in dry countries. I mean, if you have a look at that, Lake Chad, 90% gone in 30 years, and that lake feeds 40 million people. Okay, so these are big issues, and yet demand, if we're going to double food production, we probably need to double irrigation water. The groundwater accounts for 95% of the available fresh water on the planet. But in every country that uses this to grow food, they are mining it. That is, they are taking it out faster than it gets back in, and the aquifers are plummeting. People like the International Water Management Institute have warned that we are starting to face acute scarcity. We'll see this from the 2020s and the 2030s onward, right? A point where it will really stress individual communities. Now, this is not me talking, you know, the experts, listen to them. You know, the world's most prestigious scientific magazine, you know, the head of the United Nations, the US spy agencies, they're all saying water is a problem for us. Now here's an example. I mean, if you have a look at that blue graph there, that's what's happening to the water table on the Great North China Plain that feeds 400 million people. Okay, it's plummeting. Look what happened to the river too, it's empty. But that's happening in India. It's happening in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia gave up agriculture because they had mined their water. They've now moved over to Darfur. You know, it's happening in North Africa. Everywhere we're using water to grow food, we're using it too fast. Something else is happening. Now, I don't know whether you've got a gas rush in WA like we have over in the eastern states. You know, but we're already seeing large resource companies competing for the farmers' water. This is what's angered the farmers. Their future is being taken away from them by big resource companies who desperately need water so that they can meet the market demand for energy. By the 2050s, the cities will double their demand for water. So that's not just Perth, but that's Shanghai and Mumbai and London and New York. All of these cities will need twice as much water as they got today. And you know, there's only one place they can get that water cheap, and it's from farmers, because farmers currently control most of it. When there's a fight over water, the farmers generally lose. So at this point, you know, the world is saying to farmers, double the food production, but we'll only give you half the water. And that is a very big, that requires an increase of the order of 300% in water use efficiency, which is not easy to achieve. Colin Charteris, who used to be the head of IWMI, Aussie scientist, basically says, look, we're going to have to find 11,000 Sydney harbours to feed the world, you know, and that water doesn't exist at the moment. Where's it going to come from? Let's have a look at the land issue, okay? Now, the area of land available per person is shrinking fairly dramatically. It's going to be 1.5 hectares per human being by the mid-century. Okay, that's partly because there are more people, and also partly because farmers have become much more efficient, so they need less land to grow the same amount of food. However, this is rather more disturbing. You know, there's an old economic belief that if food is scarce, farm prices are high, farmers will open up more country. Well, farm prices have been high for the last decade, and guess what's happened? The area of land being farmed worldwide has shrunk by 1 Australian wheat belt every single year for the last 10 years. Why is the economic signal not being listened to by the world's farmers? Okay, this is something we need to think about. Land degradation is a sleeping giant. It menaces the whole human future. I mean, basically, every meal you eat, every meal everybody eats, removes 10 kilograms of topsoil. That's a bucket full of soil, just for that sandwich, just for that hamburger, whatever. We're currently losing soil at the rate of 75 billion tonnes every single year. Okay, it's going to the bottom of the ocean eventually. Some of it blows on the next paddock, then it gets into the creek, then it gets into the ocean. Okay, but it's disappearing. It's where we can't farm it in future. Some scientists are saying we've only got 50, 70 years of topsoil left if we go on degrading the planet. We are mining the earth at the moment in order to feed ourselves. And we all know what happens to mines. They run out. That's the FAO's picture. The FAO is very conservative, okay? So they say about half the world's fairly seriously degraded, and the other half is stable or improving slightly. Okay, that's not going to cut the mustard as far as feeding the human population is concerned. Even very well-farmed country, like Iowa in the United States, they are blowing 12 tonnes of topsoil per hectare per year. Okay, so people who think they're good farmers are not such good farmers. So this is an issue that we really, really have to solve, ladies and gentlemen. I think Australians have made tremendous progress in this space and are world leaders in it, but the world at large has lost sight of this problem. And that's what the United Nations FAO is saying, basically. We are looking at progressive breakdown of the world's farming systems if we don't address this problem, okay? And you are the knowledge repository, ladies and gentlemen, of where the knowledge to fix this problem is going to come from. So clearly there's a lot to be done in this space and a lot of knowledge to be shared with a hell of a lot of farmers all around the world. There's another dimension to this, and this also explains why the area of farmland is shrinking. By the mid-century, the world's cities will have 7 to 8 billion people living in them. Double their current population. They will occupy an area of soil the size of China. And the playground around them, that's the bit with all the golf courses and the day spas and the horse farms and the holiday farms on, will occupy an area the size of the United States. And that'll all be prime farmland because cities are naturally based in river valleys and on coastal plains. And it won't see the plough or the hoof again, at least in a productive sense, because it'll be valued out of agriculture. These cities are going to be huge. Some of them are going to be 20, 30 and 40 million people, okay? Jakarta and Manila will both have populations larger than Australia's. Cities like Shenzhen, Guangzhou, will have 120 million people living in their urban area. Now, the modern city is different from the old city in one striking and alarming way. It produces next to none of its own food. Okay? It relies on a river of trucks coming every night to restock the shops. What happens if there's an oil crisis? What happens if there's a local war? What happens if there's a big flood like there was in Bangkok not so long ago? You could see a city literally starving within a few days. A city of 20 million people. Now, we know this is real because when the Sunshine Coast got cut off by floods in 2011, the supermarkets there were empty of all food within 48 hours. You know, when people don't have enough food, they panic buy, you know, and chaos ensues. No society is prepared for this possibility. Let's talk about oil, because we need it to grow food. No matter when peak oil was, IEA says it was in 2006, you can get a big argument with any economist about when it was. This is the number I want to leave you with. This year, the world is going to make 61 million new cars. The rate at which we are making cars is 8 times larger than the rate at which we are discovering new oil. Okay, so there's going to be a crunch sooner or later. You know, what happened in 1974, for those of you old enough and hoary enough like me to remember it, could happen again. In 1974, the price of grain went up 400% because of the oil shock. Okay, so imagine what's going to happen if your supermarket bill went up 400%. But our food system is totally predicated on oil. I mean, we each eat 4 litres of oil a day. Right? That's what it takes to put your food on the table. So we haven't thought through what is going to happen to agriculture if there is an oil crisis. And Australia is particularly badly prepared because 85% of our oil comes from overseas. So any problem in the Middle East or on the shipping routes in between, you know, and we're out of oil in 2 to 3 weeks, according to the latest study, Air Vice Marshal John Barber's study. So we've got to think about the energy we use on our farms and in our transport sector and where we're going to get it from. Ladies and gentlemen, we are the first generation in the whole of human history to chuck away 1/3 to 1/2 of our food. Okay, our grandparents would have said that that was crazy. Every other generation of human beings has sought to conserve and preserve and protect their food. Whereas we're sending half your efforts as farmers to landfill. Okay, that picture is what the average Western family throws in the garbage every month. It is not good enough. That stuff goes to a landfill where it gets mixed up with old batteries and pesticides and heaven knows what. It can never be used again. Those nutrients are gone. They're toxic. So they cannot be reused in any way. So this is a very silly system that we've got at the moment, a totally wasteful system of growing food which we then throw away. The point about the little bumpy graph at the bottom is that the thing that feeds our agricultural system, potash, phosphorus, nitrogen even, which is based on based on natural gas, those are finite. And they will become scarce by the mid-century. Now, when I was writing agriculture here in WA as a young journo, the price of single superphosphate was $16 a tonne. Bet you wish it was that today. Right? It's, what is it, $400, $500 a tonne now? That's how much it's gone up in the last 40 years, okay? It'll do that again, and some, if we don't reconnect the nutrient cycle. Okay, there is a solution to this, but at the moment we're not focused on it. Climate. The climate in which agriculture was born is changing probably forever. Okay, you've heard all the debate around the IPCC report. 2 degrees is locked in. It's already up there. Okay, every time you start your car, you're locking it in. If we do nothing about this, and the odds are at the moment that we will do nothing because there is too much commitment to fossil fuels, then we're going to have 4 degrees. Above 2 degrees, it becomes very hard to grow grain in the world's grain bowls, including the WA Wheatbelt. The climate becomes just too erratic. Too much drought, too much flood, too much land degradation, all of those things. If we let this thing get away from us, you know, we are in serious trouble. The traditional agriculture that we grow up with will not be here at the end of the century unless we stop this. I've sort of, you know, culled across the scientific literature to find out what the impact is really going to be on food. The best bet seems to be every degree is going to cost us about 10% of the world's food supply. So basically, as farmers, you're going to have to run 10% faster just to stand still, just to maintain your yields. You're going to have to increase your efficiency, your cropping efficiency, your grazing efficiency by 10% for every degree. Okay, so this doesn't apply to everyone here, but it certainly applies to your grandkids. So it's not just a matter of doubling food production. As you can see, we actually have to lift world food output by 150% to allow for the climate impact. Now, of course we're going to adapt agriculture, but, you know, are we going to be able to double food production at the same time? And here's something, you know, I visited the Ag department here a few months ago, and I got a horrible shock. It was no different to the Ag department I saw back in the 1970s, you know, except the offices were empty. You know, I mean, nobody had even bothered to repaint half the place. You know, it was really run down. I mean, how could Western Australia do that to one of its greatest industries? You know, we have withdrawn. It's not just WA, it's Australia, it's America, it's Britain, it's Germany. All of the world's big countries have withdrawn support for agricultural research. If you have a look at that red line at the top right-hand graph there, that's international agricultural research funding since the 1970s in real terms. Looks like the cardiac trace of a dead patient, doesn't it, ladies and gentlemen? We're currently spending about $50 billion a year worldwide on agricultural R&D, public and private, okay? Sounds like a lot of money. But you know, that's what we were spending when the world had 3.5 billion people in it. Okay, so we have actually halved the intellectual effort that we put into increasing food production. Let me also contrast it. 50 billion on agriculture. This year we're going to spend $1,750 billion on new weapons. Okay, so human beings basically invest 30 times more in better ways to kill each other than they do in better ways to feed each other. Okay, we perhaps need to reappraise our priorities. This also suggests what the solution is, okay? If you take some of that military spending away and give it to the farmers, you can fix the problem. In fact, you'll have more peace and less war as a result of it. Okay? At the moment, we're seeing grain yields worldwide stagnating and even declining. So we've somehow got to tramp the accelerator that we've just taken our foot off. Okay, well, this is the challenge, and it's a big one, but I urge you not to be daunted by it. It is also a fabulous opportunity. It is laced with opportunities to rethink how we farm. Everywhere I go, every country I visit, I meet farmers who are cudgelling their brains to solve this problem. How do we get more food out of an environment where we are using less land, less water, less inputs, you know, that is in a more sustainable fashion? So there is great thought going on in this space at the moment. NRM is at the cutting edge of that thought. Let me just talk a little bit about the food we've got at the moment, because you know it's not that great a diet. Currently, about 3 Australians out of every 4 die by their own hand. That's the hand holding the fork, right? They die from a diet-related disease. 3/4 of our healthcare budget that you're always hearing the politicians banging on about is spent fixing a preventable problem that originates with the diet. So this is not a great diet that we've got at the moment. We can actually do something about that. This is a very interesting graph, and I wish there was some Australian data on this, but basically in 1914, this is American data, if you ate a cabbage, a lettuce, a tomato or spinach, you were going to get 5 times the amount of micronutrients out of it that you get today. Okay, so even in America with those rich soils, the result of, you know, eons of bloody tree litter, they've actually flattened the micronutrient content of their food. So you have to eat basically 5 cauliflowers for every one that your grandparents ate to get the same amount of food. No wonder we're overeating. But this is a farming problem. However, it's closely linked. Those micronutrients are vital in suppressing some of the diseases, the heart disease, the cancers, things like that. Things like selenium are closely tied to bowel cancer. You know, that's why we've got so much bowel cancer in Australia, because we are selenium deficient. You know, we supplement our sheep, but we don't supplement our human beings. So you know, this is an aspect of how do we repair the lack in our soils that just comes from using NPK year in, year out. Okay, so what are the solutions? You know, the headlines basically are we need to rethink how we farm. We need to create this new eco-farming system, low input, using fewer, you know, artificial inputs, smarter methods, much more focus on soils and soil biology than we've got at the moment. Okay? And as I say, there are farmers everywhere who are working on this. What we need to do is join all those farmers together and start a worldwide conversation so the ideas flow on the internet, social media at light speed. Okay, it's no good just talking about them here in the Wheatbelt. You've got to start talking to farmers in China, in India, you know, everywhere where they're growing grain. We massively need to reinvest in science and technology because we have taken our foot off the accelerator. We've also got to rethink this industrial diet that we have been bequeathed, you know, which is not so good for consumers or good for farmers. In fact, most farmers, you know, the cost price squeeze has reduced farm incomes in every country in the world. So this modern industrial diet is very profitable for certain people in the middle of the chain, but not good for consumers and not good for producers. So another reason it has to change. And finally, these cities, instead of wasting all that water and all those nutrients, instead of dumping it in the Pacific Ocean or whatever they're doing, they need to be putting it back into food production. Let's close the loop. So we need to actually redesign our cities. And this doesn't just mean make them beautiful. You know, it means make them sustainable. So we're going to have very exciting developments in agriculture. I think that, you know, I would love to hear organic farmers and high-tech farmers stop throwing rocks at one another and share their best ideas. You know, let's get rid of the ideological baggage and invent this new agriculture together. Okay, we need permaculture attitudes in our catchments and in our cities. We're going to see a lot more automation. You know, Rio Tinto's got all these mines operating now where nobody drives the trucks and nobody drives the trains, you know. The farms are going to be like that in 40, 50 years, maybe even sooner. But I think the focus has to be on the soil. I mean, that's the thing where we really neglected microbiology of the soil. I well remember a CSIRO scientist I spoke to told me he found 9 species of fungi in a wheat paddock in the WA Wheatbelt, and in the adjacent block of bush he found 410. Right? We have stripped away all that biodiversity out of the soil, and that biodiversity is doing something, it's keeping the bush alive. You know, how can we reincorporate that biodiversity and manage it into our food systems. So that's the kind of thinking, and then there's an example of a desert farm. Again, we can do that in Australia if we have to. You just use sunlight to extract water, fresh water from salt water, and you can grow whatever you like. So there are many of these sort of opportunities now for new forms of agriculture. But I want to broaden your minds and think, you know, if you feel like you want to diversify your farm a bit, instead of having a station in the pastoral country and a wheatbelt farm, why not have a city farm? Now, that big glass dome was built in Stockholm last year, okay? People are starting to farm the cities. There are investments of $55 million going in all the time. Places like Holland, Canada, the United States. You know, so agriculture is coming back to the city, but agriculture needs skills. It needs people who understand plants and animals as much as anything. It can be smallholder agriculture on people's back balconies. It can be a little farm on top of the restaurant that grows fresh veggies for, you know, a salad that was harvested 15 minutes ago. It can be on top of a hospital to help patients recover from surgery or something like that, or it can be a big corporate farm. Whatever it is, it needs agricultural expertise, knowledge, skill. Okay, so I'm encouraging farmers, you know, who are traditionally, you know, wedded to broad acre and things like that, to also think about being in charge of this new development in agriculture. I mean, this is what the cities of the future could look like, using hydroponics, aquaponics, vertical farms, all these kinds of things, as well as smallholder production. And here's another development which you may not like very much, but it's going to be a reality. Basically, we're going to produce a lot of food out of cultures of plant cells, animal cells, fungal cells, microbial cells. Last year, the University of Maastricht in Holland produced the world's first synthetic sausage. This year, they produced the world's first synthetic hamburger, right? Now, if you're a sheep producer or a cattle producer, what's going to happen to you is what happened to wool growers back in the 1970s. Okay, you're going to be in competition with synthetics. Be glad about that, because synthetics will take the low end of the market. They will allow you to get a higher income from producing high quality, low chemical, you know, healthy food. So there's actually an opportunity there. Just as wool is an elite textile, you know, we can have meat grown on a farm as an elite product as well, while at the same time this sort of stuff is being put inside meat pies and, you know, chicken nuggets and God knows what. But, you know, it's going to happen. You can't really stop it. Economics will drive it. So be ready for it, be a part of it if you want. The good news from this is, if we actually do produce more food in the cities, suppose cities produce 30 or even 50% of their food, how much pressure does that relieve on the agricultural landscape? How much more can you say, well, I want to give part of my farm back to natural bush. I want to grow more Australian species and animals on my farm. I want to actually manage the bush the way it should be managed, the way it was managed for the last 40,000 years. So you know, I think this is actually probably a very promising development. If cities produce, you know, the rubbish part of the food supply, that's fine, you know. Let's do agriculture sustainably on the farms. Opportunities. Look, currently we eat, you know, 60, 70 different plants. If you actually go to the markets and count all the different plants, maybe 100 if you're lucky. Bruce French, agronomist from Tasmania, has compiled a database and found 25,000 edible plants. Mostly these are known to indigenous societies around the world, but nobody else knows about them, especially the celebrity chefs. You know, but there is a world. There's a huge culinary adventure awaiting us. We haven't begun to explore our own planet yet in terms of its potential, you know, edible things, you know. I mean, let's just take our own country. There are 6,100 edible plants in Australia that we know about so far. If you go in the supermarkets, you'd be flat out finding 3 or 4. You know, bush tomatoes perhaps, something like that. But we've neglected the bounty, the biological bounty of this country for 250 years. And it's time we spoke to our Indigenous people and got this system going, because that's how we're going to look after the landscape at the same time, by growing the things that naturally belong here. But this is a huge opportunity, you know, both for farmers and for chefs. You know, wait until Jamie Oliver gets hold of this stuff. You know, it's good for you. You know, it'll fix your bowel cancer. You know, it's terrific. Now, the world's fish catch has been going downhill since 2004. We have already mined the oceans to their limits in terms of fishing. It's not going to produce another 100 million tonnes of fish, so we're going to have to do it by farming. Now, in Australia, according to CSIRO, we've got 1.5 million hectares of country in the north alone that is suitable for fish production. Fish production at 7 to 10 tonnes to the hectare. I predict that by the mid-century, aquaculture is going to be our biggest livestock industry, bar none. It will actually produce more than cattle, sheep, pigs and poultry put together. But how are you going to feed all these fish if your rainfall is getting unreliable? You know, to feed the world's demand for protein, 550 million tonnes by the mid-century, we basically need to discover 3 more North Americas. Okay, and if you go on Google Earth, you will not find a lot of undiscovered continents. Right, so where's the food going to come from for all these fish and all these animals? It's going to come from water plants, ladies and gentlemen. Water cropping could be our biggest industry ever, much bigger than wheat. You know, the nice thing about algae is that they produce liquid sunlight. Okay, the algae just sits around in the pond and it turns sunlight into oil. And the fossil oil that we've been mining and wrecking the climate with is just dead algae. Simply died 100, 200 million years ago and got subducted. Right? This stuff is fresh and you can renew it year after year after year as long as the sun keeps on shining. All you need is salt water. I look at all those salt lakes as I drive out west, you know, or east, sorry, from here, and I say to myself, why aren't we farming those? That bloke in the charming yellow shirt is up at Karratha, you know, where they are already farming algae for food products, but also with a view to producing oil for the mining industry, you know. If you squeeze the algae, half of what you get is oil, and the other half of what you get is stock feed, or something you can turn into textiles or something like that. So this is where the animal feed will come from, because you grow your algae industry, you've got an enormous amount of animal feed, or human food, in fact, very, very healthy human food, you know, full of omega-3s and 6s available to you. The key ingredient is sunshine. I mean, basically, we get more photons per square metre than any other country in the world. Okay, more sunshine falling on one patch of Australian dirt than anywhere else. Look at them. I mean, look at the Pilbara, for example. Wow, you know, have they got it? I mean, apart from the Kalahari, which is not very well inhabited, who else has an opportunity like us? Are we looking at the next Saudi Arabia, ladies and gentlemen? All that free energy. You know, it just is a matter of becoming skilled in growing the things that we really need. Okay, so this is our great opportunity. The challenge of meeting the world's food needs is huge, but the opportunities that flow from that are larger still. If we share our knowledge, we redouble research, we can develop new science-based eco-farming and food production systems. We can build healthier, more sustainable diets. We can design cities that do not waste. And we can pay farmers, fishers and food producers a fair price so that they can safeguard the earth that feeds us. Basically, among Australians, all Australians, NRM and land care groups are perhaps the people best equipped of all with the knowledge, the skills and the commitment to make this happen, to make our existing farm industries more sustainable, our diet and landscapes healthier, and to pioneer the new ventures that I've explained today. You are already leaders in thinking about this problem, But you need to convert that into being business leaders, to export Australian food and landscape know-how to a hungry world, to act as world leaders in the mighty challenge of feeding 10 billion human beings sustainably. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian.
I hear about not having enough water, but my training was always the water cycle. It rains, it flows, it evaporates, makes clouds. So where's the water gone? I thought it was the same water that just kept on being recycled.
Yep, there hasn't been an extra drop of water added to the Earth for the last 4,000 million years, and it's been in and out of dinosaurs and us and every other thing on the planet. But when we get hold of the water in our cities and our big mining operations, we pollute it. And then we tip it into the river, and the river is polluted, and then it goes into the ocean. So we're just mismanaging the water. It's not that there's a shortage of actual water. There is a shortage of clean, healthy, fresh water. So it's all the horrible stuff. We produce 100,000 different chemicals in our society. And they don't just disappear. You know, they get into the landfill perhaps, and then they leak out in the groundwater and end up in the river or in the food supply. So, you know, we have to somehow control the way that we're polluting our waters worldwide. So you look, even big rivers like the Danube in Europe and things like that, you know, they're polluted with something or other, mainly nutrients actually. So a lot of these waters are eutrophic. There's 470 dead zones in the world's estuary areas, caused by nutrients draining out of catchments. The 21,000 square kilometres dead patch just off the Mississippi, which is due to all the farming in the Mississippi catchment. So we've got to stop that system from happening somehow.
I'm a journalist, and the practicalities is it's the reinvestment in agriculture hasn't been happening because there's no votes in it. And the harsh reality is, until politicians grasp, you know, the problems, and generally they usually do it when it's too late. I mean, how do we change the political environment? And that's what's got to happen for all. Every year you're saying it's very good, but it's not going to happen unless the pollies want it to happen.
Right. Two things. Well, first of all, the investment environment in agriculture is not attractive at the moment, you know, to investors, because agriculture loses money. 90% of the world's farmers lose money. You know, only a very small group at the top actually make money. So people who have got money to burn always think about putting it somewhere else rather than in agriculture. It's too dicey. There's been more investment lately, but it's been things like the African land grab, you know, where you're displacing farmers from their land that they've held for 4,000 years, and you know, it's pretty evil. You're absolutely correct, but the thing that all politicians are susceptible to is any kind of a food crisis. There's no government on earth that would survive a major food crisis. A couple of years ago, we saw the Egyptian government and the Tunisian government both torn down by public riots that began as food price protests by concerned mothers. Right? They were out there in the public squares with their mobile phones, sending messages on Twitter and what have you, and suddenly the whole people got enraged and tore down the governments. We saw that happen. The French cut their head off the king as a result of a famine in the 1770s. The Russians shot the Tsar as a result of a famine that happened in the 1900s. When people get hungry, they get mad. So this is a message that politicians need to get. As we see the world food supply becoming creakier, you're going to see more regime changes, in inverted commas. If we want a stable, peaceable world, I mean, one of the things that's really noticeable, there haven't been major wars in Australia, America, Northern Europe in the last 50 years because people are well fed. You know, the several hundred wars that have occurred in the last 30 years worldwide have all occurred in places that are food, land and water insecure. If you want a peaceful world, you have to attend to agriculture. Now, I've met a lot of military types, like Major General Michael Jeffrey, who understand this very, very well. Politicians, as you say, don't understand it. They're driven by opinion polls. It's not easy to change their minds because their minds are like butterflies. You know, they fasten on one thing and 3 seconds later they're off on something else. And they're not thinking about the long term, they're thinking of their own survival. This message has to come from consumers. It won't make any difference coming from farmers, okay, because farmers are too few and too powerless. It's only when the consumers of the world get mad, as they did in Egypt, that you actually see politicians sitting up and paying attention, because they can end up swinging on lampposts if that doesn't happen. I'm sorry to say, you know, that we need these sorts of things to change the minds of politicians, but, you know, I'm afraid that's probably the way it's going to work. As climate change injects more erratic stuff into the world agricultural, as America suffers more and more droughts, for example, you're going to see consumers getting pretty unsettled with their politicians, and that will drive the reinvestment. Meantime, you're on your own, as you always have been. Farmers are there, they're independent, they're strong. There's 1.8 billion farmers in the world. 1 person in 5 of the human race is a farmer, mostly women, by the way. If they join hands in real time on the internet and on social media, they can change the world. Thank you.